January 17th, 1943. North Atlantic, 52 degrees, 14 minutes north, 31 degrees, 47 minutes west. The sea was iron that morning, gray, cold, and infinite. Commander Klaus Hartmann stood in the conning tower of U-604, his gloved hands gripping the cold steel railing as saltwater spray stung his face. Through the periscope's narrow eye, he watched something that defied every calculation he had made in 3 years of war. A ship, not just any ship. A vessel so impossibly large, so crudely utilitarian in its construction, that it seemed almost contemptuous in its disregard for the elegance of maritime engineering. It rode low in the water, heavily laden, its gray hull cutting through the Atlantic swell with the graceless determination of a plow horse. What disturbed Hartmann most was not the ship itself, but what his hydrophone operator had reported moments earlier. The convoy's escorts had dropped back. This Liberty ship, this mass-produced American freighter, was sailing with minimal protection. Either the Americans had grown careless, or they no longer feared the wolf packs that had once ruled these waters. Hartmann ordered the U-boat to shadow the vessel. He needed to understand what he was seeing, because if intelligence reports were accurate, inside that single hull was enough war material to equip an entire armored division. Airplanes, tanks, artillery, ammunition, medical supplies, food, all in one ship. It was impossible. No nation could produce such abundance. No single vessel could carry such diverse cargo without becoming a logistical nightmare. And yet, there it was, steaming eastward toward Britain, one of hundreds that crossed the Atlantic each month. The cold Atlantic wind carried with it the scent of diesel and rust. Somewhere above the clouds, beyond the reach of Hartmann's periscope, the war was being decided not by courage or tactics, but by production capacity. And in that moment, suspended between sky and sea, Hartmann felt the first tremor of doubt that would eventually consume every German naval officer who hunted in these waters. The Liberty ship was born from desperation and genius in equal measure. When Britain stood alone in 1940, its lifeline was the North Atlantic convoy system, a thin thread of merchant vessels carrying food, fuel, and weapons across 3,000 miles of submarine-infested ocean. German U-boats tore through these convoys with methodical efficiency, sending hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping to the bottom each month. Britain was starving. Its military was depleting stockpiles faster than domestic production could replace them. Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. By early 1941, Britain's shipping losses had created a crisis that threatened to force surrender more effectively than the Luftwaffe's bombs ever could. The United States, still officially neutral, recognized that Britain's survival depended on merchant tonnage. But building ships had always been a slow, artisanal process. A traditional cargo vessel took 18 months to construct, required skilled craftsmen, and emerged from the shipyard as a unique creation. America needed to build ships faster than Germany could sink them. This was the arithmetic of survival. Enter Henry Kaiser, an industrialist who had never built a ship in his life, but understood mass production with the clarity of a prophet. Kaiser had constructed dams, bridges, highways. He thought not in terms of craftsmanship, but of systems, modules, and assembly lines. Working with naval architect William Francis Gibbs and using a British design for a simple tramp steamer, Kaiser proposed something revolutionary. A ship built like an automobile, with prefabricated sections welded together rather than riveted, constructed by semi-skilled workers in a matter of weeks rather than months. The maritime establishment mocked him. Ships were not cars. The sea did not forgive shortcuts. Welding was inferior to riveting. The entire concept was madness. But by December 1941, when America entered the war, Kaiser's first Liberty ships were already sliding down the ways. They were ugly. No one disputed that. Their welded hulls gave them a crude, industrial appearance that offended traditional shipbuilders. Sailors called them ugly ducklings, and worse. Their maximum speed of 11 knots made them ponderous targets. Their steam engines were decades old in design. They were meant to last 5 years, not generations. But they worked. And more importantly, they could be built at a pace that would have seemed like sorcery to any previous generation of shipwrights. By 1943, American shipyards were launching 3 Liberty ships every day. Every single day. Kaiser's Richmond Shipyard No. 2 in California set a record that still staggers the imagination. The SS Robert E. Peary was assembled from keel laying to launch in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Less than a week to build a ship capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo across an ocean. The vessels emerged from 18 American shipyards in a rhythm that resembled industrial poetry. Bow sections, stern sections, mid-hull units, all prefabricated inland and transported to the yards where they were welded together like pieces of a vast steel puzzle. Women welders, many of whom had never held a torch before Pearl Harbor, helped construct these vessels with precision that matched their male counterparts. Rosie the Riveter worked on ships as well as aircraft. The Liberty ship became the foundation of American logistics, the unglamorous workhorse that would carry 15 million tons of cargo by war's end. But what truly distinguished these vessels was not their number or their speed of construction. It was what they carried and how they carried it. Traditional cargo vessels were specialized. A freighter designed for bulk grain could not efficiently transport vehicles. A tanker carried oil, not munitions. A troop ship was configured for humans, not heavy equipment. This specialization made economic sense in peacetime, but created nightmarish complications in war. A convoy might arrive in Britain with food but no ammunition, or with ammunition but no vehicles to transport it. The Liberty ship's vast cargo holds, 5 in total, allowed for something unprecedented: mixed loading. A single Liberty ship could carry P-51 Mustang fighters in its forward hold, M4 Sherman tanks on the deck, cases of ammunition in the aft holds, medical supplies in the 'tween decks, spare parts in every available space, plus food, fuel, and replacement uniforms for thousands of soldiers. The ships became floating warehouses, mobile logistics hubs that delivered complete military ecosystems to wherever the war demanded. Loading a Liberty ship was an art form that American stevedores perfected through trial and error. The heaviest cargo went low to maintain stability. Tanks were chained to the deck, covered with protective tarpaulins, their guns secured. Aircraft were partially disassembled, wings removed, fuselages nestled together to maximize space. The holds were packed with a density that would have caused traditional cargo masters to resign in protest. Yet the ships remained seaworthy, balanced, and capable of surviving the brutal North Atlantic in winter. German U-boat commanders had been trained to recognize different ship types and prioritize targets accordingly. Tankers were prime targets. Oil was the lifeblood of mechanized warfare. Ammunition ships were dangerous but valuable. Troop transports meant future soldiers who would never reach the front. But the Liberty ship confounded this calculus. When a U-boat captain sank a Liberty ship, he couldn't predict whether he had just destroyed a month's supply of fuel, or 50 fighter aircraft, or 30 tanks, or field hospitals for an entire division. The cargo manifest was a mystery until the ship went down and debris field told the story. Commander Hartman, like many of his fellow U-boat captains, had studied intelligence reports about Liberty ship cargoes with the attention of a scholar examining ancient texts. The reports seemed exaggerated, propaganda designed to boost American morale or deceive German naval intelligence. One Liberty ship supposedly carried 28 locomotives to Russia. Another transported enough steel to build an entire bridge. A third carried flour, sugar, and canned goods sufficient to feed 50,000 people for a month, plus machine guns and mortars. The variety seemed impossible. How could one nation produce such abundance? How could it transport such diverse material simultaneously? Germany, for all its industrial might and technological sophistication, could barely feed its own population while maintaining military production. Every resource was allocated with ruthless efficiency. Steel went to tanks or ships or aircraft, never all three at once. Food supplies were rationed, then reduced, then rationed again. The idea that America could fill ships with both war machines and luxury goods, chocolate, cigarettes, jazz records, struck German officers as either lies or evidence of catastrophic mismanagement. Surely the Americans were wasting resources, creating logistical chaos, undermining their own war effort through undisciplined abundance. This was what Hartmann expected to find. Disorganization masquerading as productivity. Instead, he found precision wrapped in plenty. On March 3, 1943, U-604 intercepted convoy HX-228 southeast of Greenland. Hartmann had positioned his boat along the convoy's projected route, submerged, waiting with the patience of a predator. When the merchantmen appeared on the horizon, he counted 27 ships in 9 columns, with corvette escorts prowling the perimeter. Standard procedure was to radio the convoy's position to other U-boats in the Wolf Pack, then attack at night when surface speeds gave submarines an advantage. But Hartmann wanted information before he wanted kills. He needed to see inside these ships to confirm or disprove the intelligence reports that haunted his thoughts. He selected a target, a Liberty ship sailing in the convoy's 3rd column, identified by its silhouette and registry numbers as the SS Samuel Huntington, launched 3 months earlier from a Baltimore shipyard. He maneuvered U-604 into attack position, checked wind speed and sea state, calculated the intercept angle for his torpedoes. Then he waited for the moment between dusk and darkness when visibility decreased, but his electric torpedoes would leave no telltale wake. The first torpedo struck the Samuel Huntington amidships, just below the waterline, breaching the number 3 cargo hold. The explosion was enormous, far larger than a simple hull breach should produce. Hartmann, watching through the periscope, saw the ship's midpoint lift from the water as secondary explosions rippled through its interior. Flames erupted from the hold, orange and white, burning with the intensity of magnesium or phosphorus. Whatever was inside that hold was not simply cargo. It was volatile. But the ship did not sink, not immediately. The Samuel Huntington's crew, trained in damage control, sealed bulkheads and fought the fires with extinguishers and seawater pumps. The Liberty ship's design included compartmentalization that prevented flooding in one hold from necessarily sinking the entire vessel. Hartmann fired a second torpedo, this one striking the stern, targeting the engine room. The ship shuddered, lost power, and began listing to starboard. Now surely it would go down. Convoy escorts had detected the torpedo wakes and were racing toward U-604's position, their ASDIC sonar pinging through the water like mechanical heartbeats. Hartmann ordered the U-boat to dive to 150 meters and go silent. For 20 minutes, the escorts depth-charged the area, their explosive canisters creating underwater shockwaves that rattled U-604's pressure hull and sent loose objects clattering to the deck. The crew stood motionless, breathing shallowly, listening to the destroyer's propellers thrash overhead. Then silence. The escorts moved on, responding to another U-boat's attack elsewhere in the convoy. Hartman brought U-604 back to periscope depth just as dawn was breaking. The Samuel Huntington was still afloat. Crippled, listing heavily, fires still burning in its midsection, but afloat. And that was when Hartman saw what the torpedoes had revealed. The ship's cargo was spilling from the breached holds like the contents of a shattered treasure chest. On the forward deck, secured under now tattered tarps, were aircraft. P-40 Warhawks, their distinctive shark-mouth nose art visible even from a distance. 4 of them, wings removed, fuselages gleaming in the gray morning light. In the water around the dying ship, debris told a more complete story. Tank treads, artillery shells in wooden crates, barrels of diesel fuel creating rainbow slicks on the surface. Cans of food, so much food, bobbing among the wreckage. A jeep had somehow tumbled from the deck and floated briefly before sinking. Spare tank engines, radio equipment, medical supplies in waterproof containers. And still, the ship did not sink. Hartman watched through the periscope as the Samuel Huntington's crew abandoned ship in orderly fashion, loading into lifeboats while the corvettes circled to pick up survivors. The ship's master was the last to leave, a tradition Hartman respected even as an enemy. Only then, settling lower in the water as internal bulkheads finally failed, did the Liberty ship begin its final descent. It sank slowly, with the dignity of something that had resisted death as long as possible. The aircraft went down with it. Still chained to the deck, the tanks in the holds disappeared beneath the waves. Thousands of tons of war materiel descended into the cold Atlantic darkness, lost forever 200 miles from any shore. Hartman ordered U-604 to withdraw from the area before air patrols arrived. As the U-boat slipped away beneath the surface, he made detailed notes in his log about what he had observed. The cargo manifest he reconstructed from visual evidence seemed impossible. Aircraft and tanks in the same ship, plus ammunition, fuel, food, and vehicles. The diversity of materiel suggested either extraordinary planning or reckless disregard for proper cargo segregation. He could not decide which disturbed him more. What Hartman did not know, could not know as he withdrew from the battle, was that the Samuel Huntington was not unique. It was typical. Every Liberty ship that crossed the Atlantic carried similar mixed loads, tailored to the needs of the European theater of operations. The American logistics system, built on principles of mass production and flexible distribution, treated each ship as a self-contained supply module. If one ship was sunk, others would arrive with similar cargoes. If one convoy was decimated, another would sail the following week. The system was designed to absorb losses that would have crippled any other nation's merchant marine. The statistics that Hartman did not have access to, locked in Allied shipping bureaus and convoy routing stations, would have confirmed his worst fears. In 1943 alone, American shipyards delivered 1,896 Liberty ships. That same year, German U-boats sank approximately 400 Allied merchant vessels in the Atlantic. Horrific losses by any measure, yet barely 20% of the Liberty ship production for that single year. America was building ships 3 times faster than Germany could sink them. The arithmetic had shifted. The U-boats were no longer hunters. They were merely attrition, an expensive and ultimately futile delay of the inevitable. Each Liberty ship represented 250,000 man-hours of labor. Each carried an average of 9,000 tons of cargo. The mathematics of American industrial capacity was crushing German strategic planning through simple multiplication. Hartman sensed this, though he did not have the numbers to prove it. He sensed it in the way the Liberty ships sailed with increasingly minimal escort, as though daring the U-boats to attack. He sensed it in the sheer number of vessels that crowded the North Atlantic shipping lanes, turning what had been a hunter's paradise into a target-rich but ultimately futile environment. Most of all, he sensed it in the cargo itself. The profligate mixture of weapons and food, machines and luxuries, all crammed into vessels that were themselves disposable, built to last just long enough to make one or two crossings before being replaced by newer ships from yards that never stopped working. The symbolic object that haunted German U-boat commanders was not a weapon or a tactical innovation. It was a can, a simple tin can of food. When U-boats sank Allied merchant ships, survivors were often picked up by German vessels for interrogation. These survivors, merchant sailors from a dozen nations, carried with them whatever they had managed to grab before abandoning ship. Often, this included food from the ship's stores. American Liberty ship provisions became legendary among U-boat crews who intercepted them. Canned peaches, condensed milk, Spam, chocolate bars, cigarettes of a quality that German submariners had not seen since before the war. White bread made from wheat flour, not the gray ersatz bread of wartime Germany that mixed sawdust and potato flour to stretch supplies. Coffee, real coffee, not the acorn-based substitute that had become standard in the Reich. These items were not military cargo. They were standard provisions for American merchant crews, the ordinary daily rations that every Liberty ship carried for its sailors. To German submariners living on black bread, thin soup, and the knowledge that their families at home were subsisting on ration cards that provided barely enough calories to survive. These American provisions represented something more disturbing than military might. They represented an economy so abundant that it could afford to feed its merchant sailors like nobility. The canned goods became totems of enemy prosperity. U-boat commanders kept them, traded them, studied them like artifacts from a wealthier civilization. The cans were manufactured with a precision that German industry could no longer achieve. Material shortages had degraded quality across all civilian production. The food inside remained fresh for years, preserved by technologies and hygiene standards that spoke of factories operating without resource constraints. One U-boat commander, Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock of U-96, interrogated an American merchant sailor picked up from a torpedoed Liberty ship in July 1943. The sailor, a 22-year-old engine wiper from Cleveland named Thomas Mitchell, was respectful but not afraid. Lehmann Willenbrock, fluent in English from pre-war travels, asked about the ship's cargo. Mitchell described it with casual precision. 35 tanks, 18 fighter aircraft, 200 trucks, ammunition for all weapon systems, 500 tons of flour, medical supplies for a field hospital, spare parts for radio equipment, and 20,000 rations of chocolate. The U-boat commander asked if this was considered a particularly valuable cargo. Mitchell shrugged. "Pretty standard," he said. "Maybe lighter on the fuel than usual, but otherwise typical." Lehmann Willenbrock offered Mitchell a cigarette, one of the American cigarettes salvaged from the wreck. Mitchell accepted it, noted it was from his own ship's stores, and smiled grimly. They smoked together in silence on the U-boat's deck, while the submarine surfaced to charge batteries. Around them, the Atlantic stretched empty and gray. Somewhere ahead, another convoy was steaming eastward with more Liberty ships, more tanks, more aircraft, more canned peaches. Mitchell was eventually transferred to a German surface vessel and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. But before he left U-96, Lehmann Willenbrock asked him one final question. "Do you believe you will win this war?" Mitchell considered the question seriously, then nodded. "Yes, sir. We're already winning. You just haven't seen it yet." The young American's confidence, backed by nothing more than his knowledge of what his country could produce, haunted Lehmann Willenbrock for the remainder of his war service. The transformation in German naval thinking occurred gradually, then suddenly. By mid-1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet and soon to be head of the entire German Navy, recognized that the Battle of the Atlantic was lost. Not because German submarines were inferior, they were, in many ways, technological marvels. Not because German submariners lacked courage, their casualty rate would eventually reach 75%, the highest of any military branch in any nation during the war. The battle was lost because mathematics defeated courage. Production defeated tactics. Abundance defeated efficiency. Dönitz had predicated his entire Atlantic strategy on a break-even point. If U-boats could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, Britain would starve and surrender. He had calculated that sinking 700,000 tons of shipping per month would achieve this goal. In early 1943, U-boats were approaching that target. Then the numbers reversed. Liberty ship production accelerated. Allied anti-submarine technologies improved. Escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats had previously hunted with impunity. By May 1943, Dönitz was losing a U-boat every day. The cost-exchange ratio had inverted catastrophically. Each U-boat took months to build and required a trained crew of 50 men. Each Liberty ship took days to build and, if sunk, was immediately replaced by another. The war had become a battle of shipyards, and Germany's shipyards were producing submarines that could not survive long enough to justify their construction cost. Dönitz issued a classified memorandum in August 1943 acknowledging the new reality. He did not phrase it as defeat. That would have been politically impossible in the Third Reich, but as a strategic adjustment. U-boats would continue to operate in the Atlantic, but their primary mission was no longer to starve Britain. Instead, they would tie down Allied resources, force convoys to maintain escorts, act as a fleet in being that justified its existence through the enemy's response rather than its own achievements. It was a profound psychological shift from hunters to survivors. German U-boat captains understood what the memorandum meant. They were no longer expected to win, only to persist. Their missions became almost existential in their futility. Sail into the Atlantic, attempt to sink some impossibly large convoy escorted by destroyers and aircraft, possibly survive, return to base, and repeat until death claimed you. The Liberty ships kept coming. One captain, Werner Henke of U-515, wrote in his private diary after a patrol in September 1943, "We sink them, and they build more. We count our victories by tonnage, they count their production by the hour. I have begun to believe we are fighting not a nation, but a machine. And machines do not tire, do not doubt, do not mourn their losses. They simply produce." Henke was captured in April 1944 and died in an Allied POW camp, shot while allegedly attempting escape. His diary was recovered and translated after the war, offering insights into the psychological deterioration of U-boat commanders who recognized the mathematical impossibility of their mission. The Liberty ships themselves became symbols of different truths to different observers. To the British, they represented American industrial might, coming to the rescue of a besieged island. To the Soviets receiving supplies through the Arctic convoys, they represented the material proof of capitalist productivity, an uncomfortable acknowledgement that perhaps the Americans could indeed produce abundance without a command economy. To American soldiers landing in North Africa, Italy, and France, the Liberty ships were invisible infrastructure. They never saw the vessels, only the results. Tanks and trucks rolling off beaches, supplies arriving at forward positions, the unspoken promise that logistics would never fail them. But to the Germans, The Liberty ships represented the death of a certain kind of warfare. Traditional naval strategy emphasized quality, superior ships, better training, tactical brilliance. The Germans had built magnificent warships: Bismarck, Tirpitz, the pocket battleships. They had developed the most advanced submarine technology of the era. Their officers were products of centuries of Prussian military tradition. And they were being defeated by cheap, ugly, mass-produced freighters that contradicted every principle of maritime elegance. It was as though an artisan sword maker, proud of his craft, was defeated by a factory producing 10,000 adequate swords for every masterwork blade he forged. The sword maker could point to superior quality, but the factory could simply overwhelm him with volume. The irony was not lost on thoughtful German officers. Germany itself had pioneered mass production techniques in the automotive industry and had applied industrial methods to weapons manufacturing. Krupp steel, Mauser rifles, Panzer tanks, all products of disciplined industrial systems. But Germany's industrial base was fundamentally limited by resources, geography, and Hitler's chaotic management style that pitted different arms of government and military against each other in constant competition for materials and priority. The Kriegsmarine competed with the Luftwaffe, competed with the Wehrmacht for steel allocation. Synthetic fuel programs competed with tank production. V-2 rocket development consumed resources that might have gone to producing conventional aircraft. The German war economy was sophisticated but constrained, efficient but not abundant. America's economy operated on a different principle entirely. Its factories had been producing consumer goods at massive scale for decades: automobiles, refrigerators, radios. These production lines were converted to military purposes with remarkable speed after Pearl Harbor. But they retained their consumer industry characteristics: standardization, interchangeable parts, continuous improvement, and a culture of abundance rather than scarcity. Henry Kaiser built Liberty ships the way Ford built cars. Andrew Higgins built landing craft using plywood and mass production techniques borrowed from furniture manufacturing. Boeing and Douglas built bombers on assembly lines that processed aircraft like industrial products rather than handcrafted machines. This philosophical difference, abundance versus efficiency, manifested in every aspect of the Atlantic War. A German U-boat crew ate carefully rationed food calculated to provide exactly enough nutrition for a patrol. An American Liberty ship crew ate canned peaches because they were available, and the logistics system saw no reason to limit provisions that cost almost nothing to produce and ship. The abundance was not incidental. It was strategic. Well-fed sailors worked harder, maintained better morale, performed their duties more reliably. The same logic applied to equipment. American soldiers were issued extra socks, spare boots, candy bars in their rations, not because each individual item was decisive, but because abundance itself became a weapon. Soldiers who trusted their supply lines fought with greater confidence. By 1944, Liberty ships were delivering 15 million tons of cargo annually. This represented more tonnage than the entire British merchant fleet had carried in 1939. The ships were everywhere: Atlantic, Pacific, Mediterranean, Indian Ocean. They supplied the D-Day invasion, carrying the tanks and trucks that broke out of Normandy. They delivered aircraft to Britain by the thousands, fighters and bombers that would dominate European skies. They transported entire divisions of soldiers with their complete equipment. They carried the fuel that powered Patton's Third Army across France. They even carried locomotives, disassembled and loaded into holds, then reassembled in Europe to replace damaged rolling stock. Commander Hartmann, who had watched the Samuel Huntington sink in March 1943, did not survive to see this culmination. U-604 was sunk by a British Sunderland flying boat on August 11, 1943, southwest of Ireland. There were no survivors. Hartmann's logbook went down with the boat, though copies of his reports remained in Kriegsmarine archives. His observations about Liberty ship cargoes were noted, but not acted upon. There was nothing to be done. Germany could not increase its merchant ship production to match Allied losses. It could not even replace the ships it was losing to Allied bombing and naval action. The strategic initiative had passed entirely to the Allies, and the Liberty ship was the transport vehicle of that passing. In the post-war analysis conducted by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey and similar studies, historians and economists examined what had truly won the Atlantic War. The usual answers emerged: code breaking, improved sonar, escort carriers, air power. All were important. But underlying every tactical advantage was the simple fact of production capacity. The Liberty ship was the physical manifestation of economic dominance. It was abundance made steel. The symbolic power of the can of peaches resonated beyond the war itself. In the late 1940s, as the Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe, Liberty ships carried much of the material aid, food, machinery, raw materials, that restored destroyed economies. Some of the ships were given to Allied nations to replace their own war losses. Others continued in merchant service for decades. A few survive today as museum ships, their welded hulls and simple lines preserved as monuments to industrial achievement. German veterans of the U-boat service who survived the war and immigrated to America in the 1950s occasionally encountered Liberty ships in peacetime service, converted to commercial freighters. One former U-boat commander, whose name was redacted in the interview, described standing on a New York dock in 1956 and recognizing the distinctive profile of a Liberty ship being loaded with grain for export. He stood watching for nearly an hour, he said, remembering the Atlantic, the men he had lost, the futility of trying to stop what could not be stopped. The ship finished loading and departed, just one of thousands of commercial voyages it would make. Unremarkable, functional, unglamorous, eternal. The commander realized in that moment that the war had not been won by heroes or tactics or even technology. Though all played their parts, it had been won by this: the capacity to build more, to produce more, to ship more, to sustain more, to simply overwhelm opposition through sheer material abundance. Democracy and capitalism, whatever their flaws, had proven capable of mobilizing resources at a scale that totalitarian efficiency could not match. The paradox was complete. Authoritarian control, with its ability to command entire economies, had been defeated by the apparent chaos of democratic capitalism with its competing corporations, unions, markets, and freedoms. The epilogue of the Liberty ship extends beyond military history into the mythology of American industrial power. For a generation, the Liberty ship represented what America could accomplish when fully mobilized: the transformation of industrial capacity into strategic advantage. But the deeper truth the Liberty ship revealed was about the nature of abundance itself. Abundance, as military strategy, operates differently than efficiency. Efficiency seeks to do more with less, to optimize every resource, to eliminate waste. It is the strategy of constrained systems, of nations with limited materials and manpower. Abundance, by contrast, accepts a degree of waste as the cost of overwhelming production. It builds ships that may never be needed, produces more ammunition than will be fired, stockpiles food that may expire unused. This apparent waste is actually strategic resilience, the capacity to sustain losses and continue operating without degradation. The Liberty ship, carrying tanks and aircraft and food together in one hull, embodied this philosophy. From an efficiency perspective, it made no sense. A specialized ship for tanks, another for aircraft, another for food. This would optimize each vessel's carrying capacity. But specialization creates vulnerability. If the tank ship is sunk, you have aircraft, but no armor. If the food ship is delayed, you have weapons but hungry soldiers. The mixed cargo of the Liberty ship was inefficient but resilient. Each ship was a microcosm of complete military capability. Lose one, and you lost a proportional amount of everything. But the next ship would arrive with another complete set of supplies. The system degraded gracefully, absorbed losses, and continued functioning. This philosophy of resilient abundance defined the American way of war and eventually the American way of peace. The same industrial system that built Liberty ships would later produce the consumer abundance of the 1950s and 60s. Automobiles, appliances, suburbs, supermarkets filled with canned goods. The GI Bill educated millions. The interstate highway system connected the nation. American economic power became synonymous with abundance, with the capacity to provide not just sufficiency but excess, not just survival but comfort. For the German captains who hunted in the Atlantic, the Liberty ship represented the end of one world and the beginning of another. The world that ended was one where quality, tradition, and tactical brilliance could compensate for material disadvantage. The Prussian military tradition, centuries old, had always emphasized superior training and leadership to overcome numerical inferiority. It had worked in the past. It failed against industrial abundance. The world that began was one where production capacity determined strategic outcomes, where logistics trumped tactics, where abundance defeated efficiency. This was not a comfortable truth for military professionals trained to value individual skill and courage. It suggested that wars could be won not by the best soldiers, but by the best factories. That the courage of U-boat crews, facing 75% casualties without breaking, was ultimately irrelevant against an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. The Liberty ship became the vessel, literal and metaphorical, of this transformation. It carried tanks and aircraft, but it also carried the evidence of a different kind of society, one that could afford to feed its merchant sailors canned peaches while fighting a global war, one that could build 3 ships a day, every day, without apparent strain on its civilian economy, one that treated massive steel vessels as disposable items, built to last 5 years because 5 years was all they needed to last before even better ships would replace them. In the cold waters of the North Atlantic, where Commander Hartmann and thousands of men like him hunted and died, the Liberty ship sailed on, crude, ugly, slow, and absolutely unstoppable. Not because any individual ship was invulnerable. Nearly 300 Liberty ships were sunk during the war, but because behind each ship were shipyards that never stopped building, factories that never stopped producing, farms that never stopped growing, and a society that had discovered, almost by accident, that abundance itself could be a weapon more powerful than any gun. The final Liberty ship, SS Albert M. Bow, was launched on September 30th, 1945, nearly a month after Japan's surrender. The war was over, but the shipyards completed their contracts. The ship was not needed for combat, but it would carry American goods around the world for another 24 years, a testament to the durability of what was supposed to be temporary. When it was finally scrapped in 1969, its steel was recycled into new products, its engines salvaged for parts. Nothing of the Albert M. Bow remains today, except photographs and registry documents. But its legacy, and the legacy of the 2,710 Liberty ships built during the war, persists in every modern understanding of logistics, production capacity, and the strategic importance of industrial might. The Liberty ship taught a lesson that military planners have never forgotten. In modern war, The factory is as important as the battlefield, the welder as important as the soldier. And abundance, simple, overwhelming, almost careless abundance, can be the decisive weapon that no amount of courage or tactics can defeat. The German captains, who could not believe a single ship could carry airplanes and tanks together, had witnessed not just a logistical innovation, but a philosophical revolution. They had seen the future, and it arrived in the Atlantic on vessels that looked like mistakes, but functioned like miracles, carrying within their crude hulls the entire weight of a mobilized democracy, one welded seam at a time.